one of the things I found most amusing was in that chapter where you speak of the way that continental Europe referred to meat, and the way that in the United Kingdom or the British Isles, the way that they would speak of meat of cow and meat of sheep and meat of pig, for example, because they were normally roasting the whole animal and perhaps didn't have the same sophistication in their culinary standards as continental Europe did.
Well, yeah, this is sometimes thought of as a difference between Anglo and Saxon
Yeah.
ways of dealing with animal flesh. But it has to do with the question of when one eats meat, how proximate to the animal are you? How many reminders of animality are you receiving? And there's a wonderful contrast between contemporary Occidental, we might say, food patterns and contemporary Asiatic food patterns, or if you like, between traditional British cookery and traditional Chinese cookery, leaving aside for the moment the fact that there are millions of types of each.
Yes.
That in the food writer Fuchsia Dunlop is great on this. She points out that the Chinese do a lot of their cooking, or a lot of their cutting of animals in the kitchen. And whereas in Europe, it's been traditional to leave carving a roast of meat
to your butcher.
To the eater.
Yeah.
And this is one of the ways in which that sort of medieval tension between how close a given human group was to the animals they were consuming has a contemporary echo. Because even now, there's something quite different between eating little bits of pork in a stir fry with chopsticks and carving a leg of lamb at the table.
Right. What are the other arguments for lab-grown beef?
Oh, well, it shifts and changes depending on who's talking. And my book is very much a kind of a collection of different voices rather than something that says there's this singular kind of advocacy for lab-grown meat. But when Mark Post, the Dutch scientist at the University of Maastricht, unveiled that 2013 cell-grown beef burger, he was arguing on a variety of grounds, and one of them was environmental. Another was the sustainability of protein, given the loss of farmland to climate change, and the need for sustainable protein, given the climb of the meat-eating human population.
Yeah.
As population grows in places like India and China, so the story goes, and more people want to eat meat the way middle-class Americans eat meat. So it's a story in part about responses to an idea about the Western diet, which is globalized, quite troublingly, I think. The animal advocacy angle was a little softer in Mark's original presentation, but as the cast of characters in the lab-grown meat, they would use the word space, the meat space has shifted. And as animal protection types have gained more of a voice,
yes,
and indeed have started to crowd out those whose primary motivation is environmental, I would say that the biggest motivation now has almost come to dominate the entire conversation, and that is, again, advocacy on behalf of animals to reduce animal suffering. And that's interesting because there's a very specific philosophy that guides it, and that is late 18th, early 19th century British utilitarianism, as advocated for in the mid-1970s by the Australian utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer,
yes,
who advocates ending animal farming, ending the presence of animals in the cosmetics industry. His book, Animal Liberation, has really inspired a couple of generations now of people involved in that world. Now, you asked about other motivations, and they do include human health on the theory that people need a certain amount of animal protein, or that most populations will demand a certain amount of animal protein. And that raises intriguing questions, I think, about what animal protein we actually need, about which, as you'd imagine, there are debates between dietitians and anthropologists, and of course, animal advocates and chefs.
Of course, I mean, we've had 400,000 years of eating meat, right? I believe, but it's a very complex relationship that humans have with meat, most definitely.
Yeah, it's, I mean, to be blunt, we don't need it. To be very, very, very blunt. There's a set of conversations about what drives so-called meat hunger. And some people think that it has a relationship between cooked meat supplies us with very readily absorbed bioavailable calories. There's the pleasure of the movement of the jaw as we chew. There are a variety of pleasures to meat, we would say. But why it has some kind of captivation for many people is unclear. And I'm always hesitant. I mean, the scholar in me makes me very hesitant about universalizing claims that quote unquote, we have some kind of appetite for it that's automatic. It is interesting that for many, for example, Native American tribes, there seem to be more animal totems than plant totems. And there's an anthropological literature on this that asks the question of whether or not the animals that we get food from historically have somehow provided groups of humans with a kind of important psychological focus, to the point where our sense of our own interior, or the sense of our own imaginations, is really shaped by our experience of the animals that we hunt, even if the bulk of our calories are gotten from either sedentary agriculture or from foraging. I mean, there was this wonderful moment in 1960s anthropology when anthropologists got together to debate the so-called man the hunter, and you imagine man with a big capital, patriarchal capital M,
Oh, yes.
man the hunter theory. And one of the things they came around to was the observation that in those few surviving communities of say, bush people that lived as hunters and gatherers, the majority of calories were got by gathering and gleaning and not by hunting. So that this then led to other theories about whether or not the so-called thrill of the hunt gave the hunt a kind of charisma, even if the hunt was inefficient, even if the hunt was a bad way of feeding the village.
And more to do with social bonding than anything else?
Could have been. I mean, I think there's a dense fog of unknowing about this. If you want empirical answers to the questions of why meat looms so large, why meat's cultural presence greatly outweighs its dietary significance.
Right.
That seems to be the way to frame the question. And I should say, I am an omnivore. I eat meat with enthusiasm. I try not to eat it very often, but I do welcome it. Do I feel good about that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I honestly think that if I were a more morally consistent creature, I wouldn't consume animals. I think that there is a kind of a resonance. So, the people at the Man the Hunter conference would pore over all kinds of documentation about kills and people's sort of ethnographic records of time spent with tribes that lived this way. And often what they would see is that there just wasn't as much killing as you might expect.
Right, right.
And so when I would see people in the cultured meat world bringing in images of Paleolithic spears, for example, to cite one example that I talk about in Meat Planet, I was sort of shocked and bemused. And the most cynical view of the lab-grown meat world is that it's a big marketing campaign that is sort of the tail wagging the dog of the scientific research. I'm not that cynical. And I've met a lot of very dedicated people whose work I refuse to chuck out the window in the course of my time in the world of lab-grown meat.
But at this point, is it still a thing of science fiction?
We live in an era of drone strikes and of, video telephony and of tracking my stolen iPhone from my laptop and of worrying about how my country people's votes are being swayed by excessive social media use. And we come from a time when a science fiction writer like the esteemed William Gibson is able to more or less write about the contemporary world as if it were science fictional. So I'm not sure if the distinction makes as much sense as it once may have. If you mean from the perspective of, say, golden age science fiction in the 20th century, is it something that hasn't been realized? Is it like Star Trek transporter technology or something like that? Then I would say, sure. At the moment, we're not there yet. But that means something different in our culture than it did 50 years ago.
Yeah, of course.
I would say. I think in part because decades of exposure to science fiction have changed the way we relate to the technologies that we increasingly take for granted.
Well, Ben, I really do appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. And as I mentioned before, go out and grab this book. Absolutely excellent read. I'm going through my second read, as I said. So it's thank you very much.
It's a privilege for me. Thank you for your time.
I'm sorry I messed up a couple of the questions there.
Oh no, I think you got us to a better place.
Okay, good. Thanks very much, Ben. Bye for now.